everybody. Look at this, the Cottage Temperature Quilt. The temps are all full. You know what that means. It's time to put the quilt together. So that is exactly what we're going to do today. And I know I've talked a really big game about how I want to finish it, but today we're actually going to finish it. So if that sounds interesting to you, why don't you stick around, come back, and let's see what we're going to do today. Thanks for sticking around. Let's check out what we've done so far on the Cottage Temp Quilt. Well, you can see we've put all of the blocks together, and I know you can't see all the way down to the bottom, but we do have all of the blocks done and all of the trees done. And the other thing I did was I decided to go ahead and put the center together as stated in the pattern. So I went and put the 1.5 inch strips right in between each and every row. That really helped me finish. Now, I do want to talk to you a little bit about how I came up with the final design, because I know in the beginning I said, well, let's see what I decide to do. I knew I wanted to do something a little tiny bit different than what was in the pattern or what I thought everybody else would do. And since this is our first year, or our first full year in our lake house in the retreat center, I really thought I wanted to add a little bit of a lake theme. Well, I gotta tell you, I did a lot of research. I tried a lot of different patterns. I tried looking for canoe files and creating a little pontoon boat and some paddles and things that would really bring to life the quilt as our own homestead. But you know what? Ultimately, what happened was I kept changing my mind. I kept changing the designs. I wasn't quite sure I wanted to do it this way, that way. Did I want to put it inside the rows? What would that ultimately do to the overall size of the quilt? It was so much to think about and so much pressure that I just kept putting it off and putting it off. And so this is one of the biggest lessons that I hope you glean from today's video, which is you don't always have to do something that complicated. You can do something quite simple. In fact, my ultimate goal was to make sure that I used up all of my leftovers from the quilt, because I knew I was getting quite shy of a few of the grays and pieces. And so I really wanted to take advantage of all of my leftovers, which is very on brand for me. And I also knew that as the year went on, the majority of the quilt was very, very warm. And I wanted to incorporate some of those cooler colors to help balance the quilt a little bit better. So of course I had quite a few pieces left over, and let's take a look at really kind of what I had left over. All right, if we look here, here are some of my fabrics. This is my leftover background piece, and you can see I have all of the colored pieces that I used to create the quilt. And I wound up with, let's take all the little backgrounds away for a moment and just look at kind of what everything came out at the end. So what I had was just a few leftover half square triangles, which I ultimately decided not to use in my design. And I had a few leftover squares, not too many, those out of the way. I didn't have too many leftover squares, but I did have some. So here they are. And again, I really wanted to concentrate on adding more cool colors to the quilt. So I sort of set all of the half square triangles aside, and I also set my warmer colors aside and concentrated on the cooler fabrics. So let's move this out of the way a minute. So here are the squares that I had left over. The other thing that I had left was a lot of strips like this, because if I was using the color a lot, what I would do is cut 1 or 2 of the 3-inch strips. And so I had a lot of these 3-inch pieces left over, or where I cut a strip to make a tree and had this little leftover bit. So I did have some fabric yardage available. Now, any fat quarter that I didn't use or didn't cut at all, because we simply didn't get so cold or so hot, I went ahead and put those right back in my fat quarter stash, because there was really no need to use them for this particular project. But I did have a lot of these little leftovers. So I actually, again, I'm going to move all the warmer colors out of the way and just concentrate on the leftover cooler colors. So wherever I didn't have a strip left, I could cut one because obviously I had some yardage left, but here's a lot of what I wound up with, these little leftover pieces. And it got me thinking that using up the leftover squares or strips would be a really great idea to help incorporate some of those cooler colors back into the quilt. So that's what I ultimately decided to do. Now, before we move on, I just want to talk a little bit about the sponsor of today's video, and that is magicmind. Here are my friends at magicmind, and you know, I've talked about this before, their little mental performance shot, which is just a cool little natural shot of energy, which is slow release and very natural with lots of different mushrooms and vitamins. And it's just a quick way to get in all that you need for the day. And it's a slow release of caffeine, which I actually really like. It actually reduces my need for caffeine. So I limit myself to 1 or 2 cups of coffee a day. And because it's winter and I just like the warm feel, it keeps me from going back to the coffee pot and having a lot of extra caffeine, which, you know, can cause jitters, but it also can upset my stomach. Also, my friends at magicmind sent me this really cool sleep elixir. Now, this one is berry flavored, and you're supposed to take this about 30 minutes before bedtime, and it helps to calm you down, calm your stresses, and has a lot of natural ingredients in there to help promote healthy sleep, and it helps you get back on a good sleep schedule. Now, I am a menopausal woman, and notoriously we have trouble with our sleep, but I've been very blessed that I don't have a lot of sleep problems. I may have an occasional issue, but one thing I did use this for, I've been on travel recently and driving around in a car and trying to make it to your hotels late at night, sleeping in a strange space. You know, hotel beds and hotel noise is never usually really conducive to sleeping well. So when I got back home from travel, I just felt a tiny little bit off. So it was really nice to take one of these, go to bed, take it in the evening. It relaxed me a little bit and I was able to sleep really well, and got up in the morning right in the middle of my normal time, about 5:30, no alarm, no headache, no groggy feeling. Really didn't make me feel like I'd taken any type of sleep enhancer. So I kind of akin it to a nice hot cup of chamomile tea. So this one's pretty great, and right now magicmind has them together as a bundle. So if you need a little jolt of extra performance during the day and a little help with getting your sleep cycles together at night without melatonin, I think you should give magicmind a try. So you can see in the description box there's a link to magicmind and you can check it out for yourself. All right, back to our quilt. So ultimately what I decided to do was to create a bit of a tile effect with the strips. So strip piecing the little squares together, but put it together simply, but make it look maybe a little bit more fancy or a little bit more dynamic. So ultimately what I decided to do was create a diamond border. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So by using a very simple strip set technique, I can create some little blocks that go together with my squares. So I've taken my extra grays that I had left over from my backgrounds and added in the extra squares that I have. And I made, because these little squares are 3 inches, I actually made the little border strips on either side of them an extra inch wider so that I had a little bit extra room to do this fun border. So I went ahead and strip pieced some squares and some strips together with some background and came up with these little bricks. Now by adding the bricks together in a pattern that is offset right at the seam where everything goes together, you can create a border strip that looks like this. Okay, pretty easy. And we are going to practice a little bit of bias with this one because we have to cut our border strips at an angle to add on to the outside. And I want to show you what I did with these borders and with these extra fabrics. Now you've seen these fabrics before. I have this little gray dot and this little gray swirl, and also this little gray here that I used in the cloud. So these are the 3 grays that I used in the background of the quilt. Let's take a look at those. Here's that cloud area. Here's the little bit of swirl, and down here you can see where I've used the little dot. So I've used those all within the backgrounds, and I had a little bit left over of each one. So this is what I had left over of these 2. prints right here. Not a tremendous amount, but it is a selvage to selvage piece, so I could get a nice border strip out of it. So I decided to use those 2 pieces. I had another piece which I could get a border out of, so I went ahead to use this one, and I decided to use all of them together because I've mixed and matched them in the quilt. So I mix and match them in the border pieces that I put on the blocks, and I also mixed and matched them for the end pieces. So it's all quite scrappy. And the reason I did that is because the background is so scrappy, I wanted to make sure that I used all of the grays so it made sense. So this is ultimately the border that we're going to be making. And the other thing is I only had 3 colors, so I went ahead and added in this gray as well, which is kind of a gray plaid. And you can sort of see how that's going to match up with the gray that we already have. And here's the other 2 grays. So they're going to blend really nicely. So this is going to be one border. This is the second, the third, and the fourth border. This is how I'm going to do this on the ends. Okay. So how did I come up with this design, or how did we put this design together? It's very, very simple to do right up until we go to cut these, which isn't very difficult, but it might be something new to you. So we're going to walk you through it. So the first thing that I did, let's take these pieces and move them, is put my 2 gray border strips, which again are my squares or strips were 3 inches wide as per the pattern. So I went ahead and added 4-inch strips to either side of it. Just a strip piece. This happens to be 2 squares, so I sewed them to each side, border to each side. And now I'm going to go ahead and cut those apart. I'm going to use the 3-inch line on my ruler to make sure that they're all the same size and that they're laying nice and flat. So I'll lay the 3-inch line down on the edge and cut the other side. Okay, and we get a strip that looks like that. So let's cut the other one. I'm going to make sure that this edge is actually 3 inches. So we'll just make sure that it's nice and square. And I'm going to do that by taking the line of my ruler and laying it right there on the edge of the seam of that square, and then lining it up as close to the edges of my border as I can. All right, that's how you make sure everything is nice and square. Then I'm going to flip it again, making sure it's nice and straight, and put the edge right down on my 3-inch line on my ruler and trim the sides. Okay, and now I have another block that's ready to go. Okay, so when I go to sew these together on my sewing machine, and we're going to do this together, we're going to take these squares and we're going to lay them down one by one over on my sewing machine. Here's the square that I'm going to start with. The next square I'm going to put on is this one. But instead of sewing them together like that, I'm going to offset them just by the seam. So I'm going to pretend as though I'm just matching these 2 seams together. So I'm going to lay those together, lock the seams and pin them, and I'm going to sew them together. And then once that side is sewn together, and we're going to do it together on the sewing machine, then I'm going to take another piece and line it up again the same way. So I'm going to continue in that angle until I get a nice strip that looks like this guy right here. Okay, so 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. Okay, and they're all going to sew together at an angle on your sewing machine like this. So they're going to kind of lay off to the side. You're just going to keep building your angle as you go. So let's go pin that and I'll show you what it looks like. Okay. All right, here are my stacks of blocks right in order of how I want them to go. So I'm going to take my first brick. That's what I'm going to call them because I think they assemble in bricks. And my second brick in my row. And there they go. That's how I want to sew them together, just like that. So I'm going to lay one on top of the other so that the 2 seams meet. All right. Once I get the seams lined up, I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to put my pin in at an angle. This is just how I pin to help line things up. I'm going to take my pin at an angle about 1/4 of an inch past where my seam is that I'm trying to meet. And then I'm at an angle going to come up into the seam, probably 1/2 inch or so away from where my sewing machine would actually sew. And then I'm going to line up. That's just a great line up pinning technique. I'm going to line everything up on the side the way that it should be. Put my presser foot down and I'm going to stitch. I'm going to stitch the 2 pieces together and I'm going to stitch right down until the needle gets to right into the seam. And you can see my needle's now in those 2 seams. and my pin is nowhere near the needle. Now I can slide the pin right out and keep on sewing. And I'm going to do that, making sure that the two pieces are lined up nicely, and we'll sew all the way to the end of that piece. Okay, so I've sewn down to the bottom of this one, and I started up above where this one is connected here. Okay, turn it, open it, and that's what it looks like. Okay, and now I'm just going to continue. We'll just finger press it open, and I'm going to continue on with my next piece and add it just like that, 1 to 1 to 1. So let's line these up and pin again at an angle and right up into the seam. And then I'm just going to make sure that the two blocks are together and stitch them together. Again, I'm going to drop my needle right down into that seam, pull the pin out, and keep on going. And that just helps you to align your blocks really nicely. I'm going to continue this process until I get my entire stack sewn together. All right, now that we have our sewing done, let's take a look at the one finished border piece that I have. All right, one thing I decided to do was the diamond portion of this border strip is 9 squares. And I didn't carry it all the way to the ends because, one, I didn't want to have to do all the math. It just makes things a little bit more complicated with math. So I wanted to have it be a nice little addition to what would ultimately be a straight 5-inch border. So let me show you kind of where it lands. This little line right here is 2 rows and 2 rows. This is the center of the quilt. So I wanted to make sure that I could find the center of the quilt very easily. So I used an odd number of squares. So if I come down, since there's 9, the middle square is at the 5. So it's this little citron one right here. And the points of this diamond will fit right in the center of that strip. So let me show you what I mean. I can lay that border right there, and it's now centered on the quilt. So we'll put a pin in it to hold it so you can see it. So now you can sort of see how I have lots of extra negative space up in the border, but I have this nice little accent. And I'm going to do the same accent all the way around on each side of the quilt. Now it's going to look a little different across the top of the quilt. That's okay. Right now I'm going to focus on the sides. And the reason I'm going to focus on the sides is you might have already suspected by looking at the ends here. So this is an oblong quilt. It is longer than it is wider. So it is a rectangle. And I have 9 squares through the center. And then I have this little border strip. And the border strip is selvage to selvage, the width of fabric, and I folded it in half and cut the border strip in half at the fold. And then I was able to trim my angle off, and then you can see I have a little bit left at the top and of course at the bottom, which you can't see, but it's right sitting in the center. So the 2 border ends are exactly the same size because they're cut in the middle of the border strip. So it's a 5-inch border. I'll show you how we came up with that number too, but it is a 5-inch border, and you can see I don't have a whole lot of fabric left at the top. So if I did the top and bottom first, I wouldn't have enough fabric. I'd have to add in some more length to the top and the bottom, or I'd have to add more diamonds. So something to think about if you're going to do what I've done and use up your leftover fabrics. You're just going to need to think about you need slightly more than what you've got here. But I decided to do 9 diamonds, so I'd have some nice negative space on all the way around. And then I went ahead and did my long borders first. And then I will add the short border afterwards, which will need to be slightly longer because it will encompass the border here. But it'll be fine because we'll make that work. So this is what it looks like. And I want to go ahead and show you exactly how I wound up cutting it, because that's really one of the challenges of doing this way. Okay, here is my border strip that I put together on my sewing machine, and it's all pressed. Okay, and I believe I pressed some of the seams open so you can have it lay nice and flat. Now it is going to be maybe a little tiny bit wonky, so we want to make sure that we cut it nice and straight and even, and then attach it to our border print. So this is how I'm going to do it, and I'm actually laying it at an angle because it's so long you'll be able to see. So the first thing that I did was I took my Creative Grids ruler, which has solid numbers on one side and half inch numbers on the other side. And I just wanted to lay it down and see how much space I had between the 2 points. And what I determined, if I ran the edge of the ruler along where the points of this border strip are and kind of ran the same line down through the center of the blocks, I know that I had 5 solid inches here that I could get out. So I decided to trim the whole strip at 5 inches, which then became the width of the rest of the ends of the border. So now that I know that I have 5 inches to play with here, which also gives me plenty of room on either side of the points of the diamonds here. So you see how much room I have to cut and trim, and I can have those diamonds I don't have to worry about the points when I go to sew them into the quilt. So now that I know that I'm at 5 inches, I'm going to flip the ruler because half of 5 inches is 2.5 inches. So I want to focus on this 2.5 inch line. And I'm going to move the ruler, but just so you can see, I'm going to put the 2.5 inch line basically right down through the center of all of the squares. Okay? And that'll give me an idea of what I'm cutting off on this side. And I actually come past the seams, so I don't have to worry about anything opening up or anything like that. Okay, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to bring it down closer to the end here so that I can trim one end of the strip all the way up to the other end of the strip. So again, my 2.5 inch line, whoops, I was off a little bit, is going to run right through the center of the blocks. Now, you might have to shift them just a little bit to get them to work, but essentially that's what we're going to do. So this one actually looks pretty good all the way down through the center, except for this guy right here. So I'm just going to move the end a little bit so that it fits perfectly. Okay, so now I have the whole strip nice and straight. So I'm going to take my cutter. Oops, it's not sitting well right here at the bottom. Okay, I take my cutter and I'm going to trim all the way up one side and take these parts away. And I'm going to continue down this line all the way up through the top of the border strip. Okay, so again, my 2.5 inch line right through the center of the blocks all the way to the end. And I've got this guideline here on the side as well. And trim. There we go. So that whole side is trimmed exactly how I want it to be. Okay, and you can play with it. You can move it around and shift it a little bit if it's not sitting exactly right, because it is, you know, sometimes things get shifted and wonky. Now you can see how much I have, almost 3/4 of an inch of border here. So when I go to sew my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, I'm still going to have space on either side of these points, and I'm not going to cut the points off. So now I'm going to turn the strip around to the other side. I am right-handed, so I'm always working on the right. You're going to be opposite if you're left-handed, but you already know that because the world isn't set up for you. So here is the ruler, and now I've got a nice straight edge along this side. So I'm going to flip my ruler to the 5 inch side, the solid line side, and I'm going to lay my 5 inch line all the way down the block, the border strip. And I got to come this way because I'm not off of the border strip yet. But there you go, nice and even. And make sure it's nice and even all the way down. And then take your ruler and cut your side. Okay, you can shift your ruler. Right, there's my 5 inch border. Now, it's just these ends right here that seem to want to shift. So I'm just gonna pull my end straight a little bit. And just be careful that you're cutting nice and even all the way down. Okay, and then finish trimming. Okay, so you're gonna do that to all 4 strips, getting your piece at 5 inches straight, and then we're going to add the ends. All right, so here's where we add our ends. So the first thing I'm gonna do, because I have a 5 inch border, is I'm gonna take my next border piece and I'm gonna cut a 5 inch strip. So this is what's left of this gray. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut my 5 inch strip from here, and they're all gonna be the same size, right? And I've used up just about everything that was left of that one. All right, so now I have a selvage to selvage piece, and I'm gonna take my scissors and cut it right at the fold. Now, if your piece isn't folded exactly right on the selvage, you can press this flat and then refold it and make sure it's the right size. But I'm fairly confident with this, so I'm just gonna put my scissors in here at the fold and cut it. Okay, so now I have 2 half-width strips, and we're gonna put those on either side. So I'm gonna set this one off for just a second, and my selvage is here, my end piece is here. Let's look at how I'm gonna need this to fit. And I highly encourage you to test yourself on this. So I'm gonna take my big ruler and I'm gonna find the 45-degree line on my ruler. And what you're looking for is the angle that you need it to be at to cut the angle that you have on your strip. So here's a 45-degree line, there's a 45-degree line. You kind of get the gist of it. So if I lay the 45-degree line on this strip, I can see this is exactly the angle that I need to cut, okay? So I need to do that on the opposite side so that I can make these two fit. So I'm gonna take this ruler and just move it over to here on this strip, and I'm gonna lay that 45-degree line right along the edge of the border so that it's nice and straight, so that one edge of the ruler is right here on the point of the border fabric, and the other edge is up here. So, and I just need to make sure that the line is nice and straight. Okay, so we're lining up the 45-degree line on the edge of the fabric, and then we're shifting it so that the edge of the ruler is right here on the point. And then we're gonna cut that off, okay? Just like that. And I highly encourage you to take and lay them together so you don't get confused. So now I know that these two pieces will fit together perfectly. Now, this is a 45-degree angle, and just like in binding strips, if you need it to go together, you're gonna fold it like so at a 45-degree angle, or at a 90, right? So that the two strips are laying together, but you are not gonna put them point to point. You're gonna offset them by a 1/4 inch. See that? So I've got a 1/4 inch dog ear and a 1/4 inch dog ear. And then I'm gonna sew my 1/4 inch seam. So let's take that to the sewing machine and do that. Okay, here we go. So here's my border strip again, and there is my block. I'm gonna fold them like that on each other, and then I'm gonna make sure that I have a 1/4 inch dog ear on both sides before I start sewing my 1/4 inch seam. Okay, and I'm just evening that out so I don't have too much seam. And then you can pin it if you need to. I'm gonna put a couple pins in here so it'll hold it for camera, and then we're gonna turn it and stitch it. Now you're gonna wanna be incredibly careful that we're not pulling or tugging or pushing or have this hanging off the border. I've actually got my border sitting up on my sewing surface, so it's not tugging or pulling at all, because it is a bias, so we don't want to tug it. We're just going to gently guide it through the sewing machine. Take the pin out, make sure that it's still straight, don't pull it. Can't say that enough. And then cut your thread. Then when you open it up, it should make a nice straight strip. And look at that. We open it up and it makes a nice straight edge, all lined up. And that's exactly what you want to do. So you want to do the same thing on the other side. So here's our angle, here's our fabric, our selvage is over here to the right of me, and we're going to do the same thing. There's our 45-degree line through the center of the ruler. That's definitely the angle we're looking for. So I want to move that angle right over to this piece of fabric. Slide this a little more because I'm running into my papers. And I'm going to run my 45-degree line right across the edge of the border, making sure that it's nice and even on the border edge, and it's right here to the point of the fabric. Just gotta make sure my border's nice and smooth. Okay, there we go. That looks pretty good. And now I'm gonna cut my triangle off, and those two should fit together. Perfect. Look at that. And then we're gonna take it over to the sewing machine again, folding it up at a 90-degree angle, laying it so that I have a 1/4 inch dog ear on both sides, and stitch it together. All right, so we've come back from the sewing machine. You can see that our ends are all done, and it's all put together, and we're ready to put it up on the wall. Okay, so I said before that my center block is the 5th one down, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the blue, and I'm gonna line that up with the middle of the quilt and pin it. Just stick a little pin up there so it doesn't fall, and you get the idea. Okay, now, and you can see my top blocks are right in line with one another. All right, so the border's all done. We've gone ahead and put it up on the side. And you can see, again, I have enough fabric up here to trim properly. Speaking of trimming, I really wanted to talk to you about trimming the lengths and widths of your quilts. So now the easiest thing to do would be to pin this border at the center and pin it down the sides, stitch it on, and then press it open, take my ruler, and trim off the top and the bottom of the border strips, and then I'm ready to attach the top and the bottom. And you can do that, but if you've ever put a quilt together with, and as we all do, these quilts, when you put them together, have some sort of accumulated error. If you've ever had a quilt, when you got done with it, the borders just weren't quite square, or things got a little wonky, and maybe you didn't notice it until after you got it back from the long armor and you went to trim it, and you trimmed off a whole lot of one side of the border and not as much of the other. And that is a rippling effect that can sometimes happen even to good quilters, okay? So even if you're a perfect piecer and you know exactly what you're doing, you can have this rippling effect. And it can be overly enhanced by the flipping and cutting method. So the proper way to trim your border is to measure, if I'm doing the length of the border, is to measure my length from the center of the quilt down to the bottom center of the quilt. And then again, about 1/3 of the way over here and 1/3 of the way over here. And you will find, most likely, 99.9% of the time, that these three measurements will be slightly different. Now, you're going to lay them out flat, and you may find that they're 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch longer or shorter than the actual measurement length of the quilt that we thought we were making. And that's okay. And you may find that each of those measurements are off probably as much as 3/4 inch, sometimes as much as an inch. It's all right. So what we're going to do is take those three measurements and we're going to add them all together. And then we're going to divide them by 3. You can use your calculator or your phone. The divisible number, the one that you divide by 3, will give you the average of those 3 measurements. And then you're going to fold your borders in half right here at the points, and you're going to cut your borders to that measurement on both sides. So I really want you to get into the habit of doing that. It is an incredibly helpful technique that will help to prevent that rippling, because if one side of your quilt is 3/4 inch longer than the other side of your quilt, by moving and maneuvering those borders to the right size, you will help to square up anything that's been going on the inside of your quilt. And then once you've cut those borders to size, you're going to pin the top of the border and the bottom of the border, and then an average in the middle, and you're going to kind of walk the border around. I don't want to use the term stretch. I am going to use the term ease. And if you've ever come from the sewing world with clothes, you know you have to ease things in. You ease things into a curve, things like that. You're going to ease the border on. And in some cases, it will pull a border that is too short or squeeze in a border that is a little too long. They won't be off by a lot unless your piecing is really off by a lot. But most of the times, those 3 numbers will be no more than about 3/4 inch away from one another. And they're usually closer to 1/2 or 1/4. And that really depends on the accuracy of your quilting. So do make sure you take your time to measure through the center and both sides of the quilt, not on the edge, but about 1/3 of the way through the quilt, right in the middle, and then about here and here. And take the average of those 3 numbers and cut your borders to size. And I would never ever cut my borders to size before I measured. So if you're reading a pattern and it says, when you get to this stage, cut your border at this length, I would never do that. I would definitely measure through and make sure you're taking the average of your quilt so that you don't mess up, cut something wrong, cut something too short, because your ease or your accumulated error might be significantly different than the one that the pattern designer has. So once that's all done and you have your side borders on, you're going to do exactly the same method to put your top borders on. And you're going to measure through the center of the quilt with the 2 side borders on, and about 1/3 of the way up and 1/3 of the way down. And then you'll get the average of those 3 measurements, and you cut the top and bottom borders to those sizes. And you should have everything, all that you need with those single border strips and your squares down the center. Now you could do more squares if you wanted, and you could end your border a little bit closer to the top, or you could do a couple in the middle or something like that. But it's just a fun way to do a border. If you have a lot of squares left over, it's very, very easy to sew all your squares together and just put them all the way around. And you can ease those in when you get to the top and the bottom by just trimming the edges just a little bit if the math is a little bit different. If you measure all the way through the quilt and you get your average, you should be able to find a divisible number. So maybe you can take squares and size them down a little bit and use up all the leftover fabrics around the outside and use all the colors. That's entirely up to you. But this is the way I decided to finish mine. So as you can see, I have the side borders on. Now my quilt has gotten a little bit too big for the design wall back here, but I've showcased the one on that side. So I have both side borders on. And I did measure through my quilt top 3 times, came up with a measurement of 62.5 inches. So I folded them in half and cut the borders on my cutting mat to 31.25. And you may be going, I don't know, say that again? Well, I thought I would do the top and the bottom borders with you so that you can see exactly how I do that. But you can see here, I've got 2 different borders on with 2 different gray fabrics, and they're both lined up along the top and along the middle, and you can see how pretty the outside border looks, and it really draws the cooler colors towards the border so you can see. So I think it'll look really nice with the same number at the top and the bottom. So the top and the bottom of the quilts are a little smaller than the sides, because we said it's a standard rectangle, and I used the same number of blocks, so it's going to be a little longer. The squares on the side, or the diamonds, are going to be a little longer on the top and the bottom than they show on the sides. So, and it does give me room if I really wanted to add a little bit of applique to this upper corner or lower corners. I can do that if I want, because I've got some extra space. But, you know, let's see what we come up with. So let's take the quilt top down and we'll measure through, and I'll show you exactly how I went ahead and cut the borders. 28.75. So I got very lucky that all of those numbers are the same, and it's the half measurement. So I'm going to go ahead and cut all of my borders at 28.75 inches. So we'll move my top. So if you're able and you have the space to cut the whole long strip, you would cut it double that measurement. You could measure that out in one straight long piece. So here's the center, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Remember, my 5 blocks is the center. And I'm going to fold my border exactly on the point, matching up the edges as best I can, and lay it down on my ruler. And I'll pick it up a little bit so you can see it from here. Lay it down on my ruler, and I make sure that all of the edges of the border are even. Okay? And then I'm going to go down to 28.75, and I'm going to cut the border ends off. So let's do that. 28.75. Going to match up that line really well because I can't do it twice. And we'll cut it. Okay, and I'll have this little extra left. And so now this border is exactly the size we need to pin to the top and bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and do that one more time, 28.75, while I still have that measurement in my brain. So remember, I have 9 squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the center square. I'm going to fold the diamond in half right at the points, and that way I get the exact center point of the quilt. And you may have been told many times not to measure on your mat, and you do have to be very cautious about measuring on your mat. I'm using a Creative Grids mat, and I have tested the mat and measured the mat, so I know that the mat is a good measure. But yeah, a lot depending on where you get your mats, sometimes the measurements are not exact, so you do have to be careful when you're quilting measuring on the mat. But for borders, it's very handy if you've got a good measured mat. All right, so now I'm going to go down here to 28.75, make sure it's lined up, cut the ends off. So now, this is my new fabric, by the way, that I introduced, this plaid, and I think it's a good choice. I think it blends in really nicely with the other fabrics. Even though they're a little bit lighter, I think it's good. So I may use this one on the top because it's so much darker than the others. But now I have 2 borders, and they're cut the same size. So now I'd like to show you when attaching the border exactly how I do the ease method if you come up with an average that's a little smaller or a little bigger than what your actual end of your quilt is, because it's probably not going to be the same as the measurement through the center anyway, even if it's off by just a tiny little bit. So here's my quilt top, and here's my border that I want to add to the top of the quilt. I have measured through the center, and I found the center point of the quilt to be right here at the seam, the roof line of the house. So I want to line up my center of my border right there at the quarter line so that I know that all of my diamonds are going to be in the center of the quilt. So I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to lay the border print right along the edge, and I'm going to make sure that this point here where the seam line is for this diamond is going to match the seam line here for the roof line, which is exactly what I've done. And I'm going to go ahead and pin the center point. And you're going to do this with all borders. Even if your border's pieced, you're definitely going to want to line it up. If you do the line up with the center seam of the border with that, that's perfect. But you definitely want to pin at the middle and at the sides. So we're going to, now that we're pinned in the middle, we're going to move this over so that we can see the side of the quilt. And we're going to concentrate on one side at a time. So we've got our center point pinned, and we're going to lay the end over here exactly right. And you can see it's pretty close, but I've still got some ease to do. So I've layered it out here with the 2 points matching, and I'm going to pin it and be sewing it from this spot down. And then I want to show you there's like a little bit of flop, not a lot, but a little bit. So we're going to be easing that. So what I like to do is I like to just kind of hold on to the 2 pins and shake it a little bit. And then I'm going to make sure that my border in the center between those 2 pins is lined up properly, and I'm going to pin there. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to grab the 2 pins, kind of make sure that, you know, there's not a lot of gapping, that it's lined up with the edge of everything just perfect, and I'm going to pin in the middle of that. Do the same thing on the other side between the 2 pins, and I'm going to pin there, and that should even out any gapping or stretching, and it just makes it nice and easy. And then we're going to do the same thing when we're at the sewing machine. So now I'm going to take the center point of the quilt and move it onto the table so you can see it. And I'm going to lay this half of the border down. And sometimes it's really funny, you can center the borders together and one side will match perfectly and the other side won't. It's just odd, which is kind of almost what we have here. But actually it matches pretty good. It's only just off by a tiny little bit. So I'm going to match up the corners again. I'm not pulling and tugging. You see how I'm just kind of using my fingernails to kind of move it around. And I'm going to pin it even. Grab the 2 pins, kind of shake it loose, and pull it back onto the quilt top. Just kind of move it around with your fingernails and find my center point, put that down, and then same thing. Just kind of move it around. And you're kind of easing the border right to fit. Okay, same thing here. Just kind of moving it around and easing it in. And obviously this one's not off by a lot, but if it were off by a little bit more, you can actually kind of walk your fingers through to find that center point. Just kind of mark the center point and then kind of back your fingers back up, and you kind of ease that all along so it's not caught like a big loop and it puckers or anything like that. You want to ease it out so it lays as flat as possible. And if it's too short, the border, then you're going to want to ease the border out a little bit. And if it's longer than the quilt top, then you're going to want to ease the corners of the quilt top out a little bit to meet. And that's how you get anything that's out of skew to sort of stretch out and become nice and even. Okay? It kind of squares up any wacky things that are going around. So I'm going to sew this down. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. All right, gang. And of course, the quilt is far too big for my design wall. But you can see that it's all done. I folded it over on this side, and you can see that I have this border here on the side and then the same border up at the top. And of course it is the same all the way around. I think it looks really cute, and I think that it adds exactly what I wanted it to add. And I actually find it fun that I have this mix of grays in and around the border. So the final finish is, what do we do with all of these wonderful leftover pieces? Well, I have a suggestion then that maybe I can use all the leftover border strips or leftover block strips that I have of these pieces and sew them end to end and create a really fun pieced binding, which will also pull in all of the colors from the rest of the quilt. So I have some blues and greens and all that, and I think, again, because the majority of the quilt is so warm, I'll probably use the cool colors around the outside just to tie the whole quilt together. And I really like the border. I like how I've left enough space here so that I didn't have to worry about points for all the little diamonds. So they're kind of floating in the border, and it's really fun. I think it looks exactly the way I wanted it to. And I put the darker gray border at the top, the darker gray pieces at the top, just sort of to highlight what the top of the quilt looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and quilt this one and finish it off with a pieced binding. And I'm very anxious to know, you should hit me up in the comments and let me know how you're going to go about finishing your quilt. It's very simple to do. It's just slightly different than the original photo of the quilt, which shows an all white border and just a plain brown binding around the outside. So I think it jazzes it up just a tiny little bit. And like I said, if you really wanted to, you could take all your diamonds up sort of toward the corners. You could take your individual half square triangles and make some little cornerstone pinwheels or something like that if you wanted. I'm not going to do that. I have another plan for something I'm going to do with those at a later time. But anyway, this is the finish of the Cottage Temp Quilt. I hope you've enjoyed the journey. Definitely leave me a comment. If you love the videos, you know what to do. And also check out the link for magicmind and its twin, its mental performance shot and its sleep elixir, and see what kind of specials magicmind is running and give it a shot. Until next time, I hope you'll check me out online. I hope you'll check out the retreats that we have going on, and I hope you have a wonderful, happy time quilting.